Yeah.
That's all?
Yeah, just on 3.
All right, so we're in good shape. Or shall we begin?
Yeah,
Sure.
of course.
Thank you all for coming. This is our final CAC discussion of the fall semester, and we welcome today Mark Stelter and the panel. The discussion is there an ethics of teaching? Mark, perhaps you'd like to introduce the respondents, and then we can just...
I'm Mark Stelter, I teach criminal justice. Tim teaches philosophy, and Bob teaches English. And we thought it would be interesting to meet with colleagues and talk about what ethical duties do college instructors have. And of course, it's a huge, broad topic, and it includes duties that we have to students, duties that people have to us, duties we have to our disciplines, to the administration, and what do you do if these duties conflict? And what we really thought would be fun would be to spend most of our time leaving those sorts of questions and discussions open to everybody in the room. And so we're going to just take, hopefully, maybe the next 15 minutes or 20 maybe, and then leave the majority of the time for a robust discussion with our colleagues. I passed out this sheet that you probably have that says, how are we different than Walmart cashiers? And I should begin by saying, with no offense to Walmart cashiers, I just think that we're different, or we should be, or how are we different? In the same way we're different than the duties that medical doctors have, or engineers, or lawyers, or other professions. And so not to disparage Walmart cashiers, but to say, are we just like Walmart cashiers, or Exxon employees, or Anadarko employees, or are teachers different? And I would posit that they're different. There's some different nomenclature. I think when I hear the terms around here, employee, employer, boss, and supervisor, and rules, and students as customers, sort of borrowed from the corporate culture. I don't know, that doesn't sit well with me. I thought we were colleagues, and we're not employees and bosses only, but colleagues. Even my dean, I look at it as my colleague. My president, I look at it as my colleague. And I think that's a healthy way to look at it. But even more substantively maybe than the nomenclature is governance, in that I would think that traditionally what separated college professors from some other professions is that we had some amount of shared governance, that we had some amount of separation of powers, meaning that unlike a Walmart employee, where there's no separation of power, where the Walmart employee has no shared governance and does what he or she is told, and that's the deal, that's what they signed up to do, and everybody is okay with that, that we had some sort of areas that we had some autonomy, or at least some limited autonomy, over, such as how we teach in the classroom, or maybe what textbooks we use, or whether we give an essay exam or a multiple choice exam, or what those essay questions are, or how we grade it, or how we deliver our message. Also, generally, there's a relatively flat chain of command in a collegial institution instead of a strong hierarchical chain of command, so that Walmart employee people would generally take orders, move out, draw fire. In a academic institution, people would usually sit in rooms like this and have conversations and try to come to some reasoned consensus instead of simply following some sort of orders. Also, that you be active in the creation of these rules, and active in hiring decisions of your fellow colleagues, as we are, and active in hiring of administrators, as we always have traditionally been. And then there's great latitude in how a college instructor, a college professor does her work, whereas there's much less latitude in how a Walmart employee does her work. And so this is the list that I passed out. Other things like that, little supervision is given generally to professionals and particularly to academics, whereas greater supervision is given traditionally in non-professional fields, such as the Walmart employee. So, with these differences in governance, then there should come also some differences, I think, in our ethical duties and in our agency. Agency's been much bandied about lately. In fact, I think we just did a CAC session on agency recently. And so I made a list of who are these duties, what duties do we have? Who do we owe these ethical duties to? And so I'm sure you can come up with others, but I thought we owe a duty to our discipline, to our students, to the community, to the institution, to our colleagues, and to the administration. And to be controversial, I put them in that order because sometimes these duties conflict, and when they do, hopefully they don't, and often they don't. But if there was a conflict of a significant, substantial duty that we owe to our students with some duty we owe to the administration, I think it's our ethical obligation and what makes us college professors to defend and uphold and honor that duty, that higher duty that we have to our students. I put my discipline above my students. Even those of us on the panel have had disagreements about that. So some people might say, well, my highest duty is to my students, not my discipline. Some might say it's to their colleagues, not to their students. I don't know. But I think when our highest duty is to our administration, then I think we've ceased becoming college professors and we've become Walmart employees. So what happens when you have a conflict of duties, which is in honor of David Zimmerman? I used a double-sided and don't want to waste paper, so it's on. It's if you flip it over, it's on the. That's an inside joke for those in the Bell's division. It's on the back side, which is a good idea because I like trees as much as I like David. And sometimes these duties conflict, right? And so the really interesting ethical questions, whether it's in criminal justice or theology or or philosophy, I think the really interesting ethical questions are not those questions of here's something I should do that's right, and here's something I should do that's wrong. Those are interesting enough, but I think the real serious ethical dilemmas come when you have a conflict between two duties. You maybe, in my field, maybe you'd have a conflict between the law, your duty to the law, your duty to your partner. Something like that. So we'd have a conflict between two legitimate duties. I think for most people who have jobs of any sort, whether they're Walmart employees or college professors, that conflict often comes in. I have a duty to my discipline, my students, and I also have a duty to feed my family, right? So, and you do. I mean, that's an important duty. And so you have these conflicts, and what should you do when these conflicts arise? And hopefully they don't arise very often, but sometimes they do. And so I thought, well, to make it more practical, I listed these 5 sort of practical, utilitarian, if you will, devices that I, kind of try to go through in my mind when I'm thinking, what should I do? Is this a hill worth dying on? Is this really an important duty? Is this where I should take a stand? And so I'd ask, how egregious is the breach? Is it a major ethical violation, or is it just a mere inconvenience? If they tell Tim, from now on, we're not going to teach Plato or Socrates, he might think that's pretty egregious. On the other hand, if they say, we want you to teach Intro to Philosophy on Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 9 a.m. instead of 10 a.m., that might be a mere inconvenience and not really something that he thinks he has to mount his steed and get his lance and go into battle for. And then number 2, I asked, well, how much time, energy, attention is this going to sap for my higher duty? Let's say it's some administrative function. How much time is this going to take for my students, for my duty to my students? maybe it's a minor amount, maybe it's not a big deal. It's a form or something. So, you can fill that out. That's not really impinging on my life a whole lot or on the life of my students. Again, how much damage or harm does it cause my students? Number 4, does it serve any meaningful purpose? I'm shocked at how often the answer to that is no. But nonetheless, sometimes we have to do these things. But I think that's an important question. Does it serve a meaningful purpose? And then does the purpose it serves outweigh the costs? Which led me to 2 other kind of subset questions I asked, which is, what about cumulative costs, right? What if something that you're asked to do, you don't feel it's an egregious breach of your duties, of your ethical duties to your students, or your discipline, and it only takes 10 minutes. But, you can also die the death of 1,000 cuts, right? Where 10 minutes here, and 10 minutes there, and 10 minutes here, and pretty soon you don't have time for your discipline, you don't have time for your students, you don't have time to teach. And so what do you do about these small incremental encroachments upon your lives as teachers, if there are any? And then ideally, the question when I ask, does the cost outweigh the benefits? Does this ethical breach, is it outweighed maybe by the benefits? I think, and Tim and Bob can disagree, I think, to me, an ethical way to phrase that question is not, what is the cost to me personally, but what is the cost to my students? Not, well, I could do this, and it'll make this class a little bit worse, and it'll waste a little bit of time, but it'll make my life easier. It will make it so that somebody, some person somewhere smiles, or at least they can frown. I don't think that's the right question. I don't think that's an ethical question. I think then that's just a pragmatic, sort of a selfish question. How does this help me? I think the question should be, does this help my students? Does this hurt my students? What is the cost and the benefit for my students, not for me? The answer for me is always do whatever your boss tells you to do. But I think we do that, we're Walmart employees then. So, last but not least, just some points to remember if you decide to engage in some of these battles. Most of the time, the consequences for protecting our students or our discipline from administrative nonsense is negligible. Most of the time, it's not. No one's asking you to sacrifice your life, to stand up for what you think is right. And most of the time, I've found that most administrators think some of these things are as idiotic as we do. They really don't care about them that much, right? They just don't want to know that you're not going to do it. So if you're supposed to, fill out a form, and you ask your administrator, you ask, what is this form for? I've often been told, no one cares. I don't care. I just don't want to have to say that you told me you weren't going to do it, and I said it was okay, because I want to be able to CYA. So just don't tell me about it. Right? Don't ask, don't tell. Or as I sometimes say, it's better to ask forgiveness than to ask permission. Because if you ask permission, the answer is always no. I want to turn it over to these guys, but you can read this. You can see basically the bottom line is, usually you can fight for your discipline, you can fight for your students, and it's not gonna cost you that much. That's part of what we do. That's who we are, and our administrators should know that. And if they don't know that, do you really want to work for these people? If it really is going to cost you your job to do something you think is right, is that the kind of place you want to work anyway? And lastly, sometimes, very seldom, but sometimes you might have an ethical duty in your life, here or elsewhere, that does have consequences. Sometimes these things actually have consequences. They're not things we just talk about. Sometimes it might cost you your reputation or your job. But in those times, you have to look in the mirror and ask that question that Jean Valjean asks in Les Miserables, right? Who am I? What does it mean to be a college professor? So, with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
All right, so when Mark asked me to be on this panel, I immediately said, yes, I want to be on this panel. It sounds great. And the original prompt is there an ethics of teaching? And the more I started thinking about it, the more I was kind of disappointed in myself, because I never thought about that. I just teach, I just go in there and I sort of do my thing. And then when you start to write about what you do and you consider a question like this, I think as teachers, as professors, we get passionate. So I started writing some things, and I got into maybe a 7-page manifesto about the importance and ethics of teaching, and I was like, that's not going to fly. And then no, I got rid of that one. And we agreed we try to make it more of a group discussion, so I limited my points to just 2 pages. So for those of you who know my teaching style, I'm usually a bit more animated, and I walk around and talk almost endlessly. I'm going to try to stick to the script this time, so forgive me for reading to you guys, but I wanted to make sure that I stayed on point and sort of stayed into the time that I feel that I'm allotted for this discussion. So if you have any questions, please interrupt me. If there's something that it doesn't seem clear, interrupt me, and I'll try to explain it a little bit better. So is there an ethics of teaching? Very simply, I would say no, kinda. If we're asking if there are objective moral imperatives upon which we develop the norms of teaching, I wouldn't imagine an affirmative response. But if the question allows for some relativistic wiggle room with a pragmatic means-ends relationship, and if we decide to call that pragmatic means-ends relationship an ethics of teaching, then I would say yes, kinda. So I want to talk about my relativistic wiggle room, kind of what I see as our responsibilities or the ethics of teaching. So part 1, I just called what we owe our discipline. My primary obligation is to my discipline, philosophy. I fell in love with philosophy. I spent the majority of my adult life obsessing over her. I couldn't begin to count the lost hours of sleep we've acquired together. She's with me during the most significant moments of my waking life, and at times has offered clarity to my dreams. Since we've been introduced, there has not been a salient experience that she has not accompanied me in one aspect or another. The amount of money I've invested in our relationship can be seen as obscene. I'm reminded of this investment on the 8th of every month by a mutual friend of ours that used to go by the name of FAFSA. Selecting a discipline or trade, for those of us who are so lucky, is what my friend and colleague Mark Whitten would refer to as a lithe and momentous decision. Like most of us, I chose to become a custodian of my discipline, and I embrace the responsibilities and obligations that come with that role. There will always be those who practice their discipline without acknowledging it as much more than a means to a paycheck. But there are professors, teachers, and students who serve as the protectors of this scholastic endeavor. Each discipline is entrenched in its own set of norms. Where would the sciences be without the scientific method? Where would literature be without originality? What would history look like without verification? What would any discipline look like without the lasting contributions of philosophy? I wouldn't consider myself an alarmist, but there has always been, and I imagine always will be, those who oppose philosophical investigation, not only in philosophy, but in all of our disciplines. Those who embrace the herd mentality and those who care more about status than truth. From the prosecution and the persecution of Socrates to the diminishing role of liberal arts in higher education, to an unnamed community college which preaches critical thinking yet takes logic out of the core. Whether we like it or not, we are the last line of defense. We are the top floors. We are the guardians of the academy. I love philosophy. I've devoted my life to philosophy. And with anything that one loves, I believe there's an obligation of protection and promotion. But how? This is where I go to the second part in regards to what we owe our students. So while I don't subscribe to an objective moral theory on any level within the comfy confines of the relativistic wiggle room, I do embrace virtue ethics as the best means to the ends laid out in part 1, that is the protection and promotion of our discipline. Aristotle lays out a model for the ultimate end or goal of human activity. This goal, eudaimonia, is a type of wisdom based on happiness, which is peculiar to human and human reason alone. This goal can be attained by embracing the godlike part of our nature, that is reason. According to Aristotle, the other virtues lend themselves to the attainment of wisdom, and thus happiness, or eudaimonia. While this is undoubtedly an oversimplification of Aristotle's virtue ethics, it prevents enough of a cleave to introduce a virtue-based or directed theme as to what we owe our students. Keeping in mind the goal for our students on this model will be a wisdom-based happiness. So then, Our obligation becomes something akin to a cartographer, pointing students in the direction of eudaimonia. The map we provide ought to be filled not only with the virtues and lessons specific to our discipline, but virtues and lessons about what it is to live a happy life, which as I see it has very little to do with income, degree, or job. Some points of interest along the road toward eudaimonia are fairness, passion, compassion, understanding, courage, temperance, justice, acceptance, staying true to yourself, industriousness, diversity, and perhaps a little unyielding search for truth. The beauty of the relativistic wiggle room is that it maintains that there is no correct way to achieve what I perceive to be the proper end, but several. We all have unique teaching styles, perspective, experiences. We all have something different to offer. For our students, the important thing is that we not only teach the virtues and lessons of our discipline, but also embrace them. Attesting to that, you should notice how well-spoken Bob is, how legally just Mark is, and how confused I am. And so I moved to part 3, where I kind of see this relationship where discipline and students sort of have this crossover, which I call the symbiotic relationship. Going back to what I see as my primary obligation, my discipline, I didn't enter philosophy because I wanted to teach. I entered philosophy because I couldn't imagine my life without it. As an instructor of philosophy, I'm lucky enough to have the opportunity to present my discipline to other people on a daily basis. As I mentioned above, the duty to our discipline is to protect and promote. I see the student-discipline relationship as symbiotic. One cannot exist without the other. Leo Tolstoy describes the role of art as a means by which the observer becomes infected with the same feeling the artist puts into the work. I see the relationship between myself, my field, and my students in a very similar fashion. As professors, we have the opportunity to infect our students the same way we were infected at the beginning of our scholastic pursuits. We carry on the traditions and virtues which have infected us, and we owe it to both our discipline and our students to keep the beautiful side of those traditions alive. I gave a point of reference on that last thing regarding Plato and Socrates. As most of you know, Socrates is the teacher and Plato is the student. But what I know here is that we wouldn't have Socrates if it wasn't for Plato, and we wouldn't have Plato if it wasn't for Socrates. So I'm not claiming to be Socrates, and I don't claim that my students are going to be Plato, but I think that's the relationship that we're looking for. If you get rid of one, you can't have the other. So anyway, that's basically where I'm coming from.
Well, when I heard the prompt, I did not commit to the discipline. I committed to the students. And there were about 3 threads of thought that kind of followed from the original question that Mark asked, is there an ethics of teaching? First, I said, what are the names that we call ourselves relative to our students or within the institution in which we function, and what implied ethical relationships do they have? We have academician, faculty, teacher, instructor, facilitator, that retail phrase from University of Phoenix, and also from Sesame Street, really. You can make the connection there if you like. Master, I insist they call me Master Bob. And professor. I will not go through all of these etymologies, but a couple things are worth noting. Teacher is the most generic term we use, and this is someone who shows or points out to someone else. It strikes me just as adult human beings, we have that responsibility, regardless of how resistant the youngsters might be. Instructor. This is pretty self-explanatory. We do have to put structures into their heads other than the ones they have. We also have to teach them how to evaluate, manipulate, choose among them, and the like. Facilitator, I will skip over. What is nice about the master is that it's the chief, the head, or the authority, but there's also a more modern word that is attached to it still, and it's the idea of the coach, the master and the apprentice. Something I think we've lost a little bit. There's a any master-apprentice story you ever read, you can smell the ethical relationship that's involved in it. So I suspect that it's still strong there, whether you like it or not. And the professor, this is what he told you. The professor is the person who pro fatere, forth acknowledges. And his job primarily is to acknowledge his knowledge to his professional colleagues within the discipline. So regardless of your official title, you were professorial in your presentation first. The one that I say for last, it's the one that I think of, the one I can't help but be, is educator. which of course means to lead up or out of, as we all know. And of course, the old take on that is we lead the ignorant from darkness into light. I'd like to put a bit of a new spin on that and suggest that what we actually do is we lead a person. I'll come back to that notion in just a few minutes. It's our job to lead a person out of the students who are in front of us. The two other threads that came to mind, one was a distinction that was made by Albert Nock back in 1932 between schooling as education and schooling as training. And he basically said this. He said, learning for the purpose of training is all about skills and expertise. If you brought 10 experts into the classroom, be they plumbers, lawyers, or surgeons, and you asked Albert Nock if they were educated, he would say, I don't know. Because their expertise has no bearing whatsoever on this question. Whereas learning for the purpose of being educated is learning for the purpose of developing your intellect and your moral character. It sounds really old-fashioned, doesn't it? The third thread was from a gentleman named Richard Mitchell, who parenthetically I had the chance to meet. He kind of called himself the underground grammarian. He was a critic of institutionalized language, a big and important category of language today. Would you not agree? By the way, I don't mean here, I mean in even bigger venues. Especially that of politics and education. In the interest of dramatic tension, to create a sense of urgency and remembering that urgency always trumps importance, I will leave that adage unstated for a moment or two. So when I approached this, the only thing that I thought of was, what is it that I, as a language teacher, must pull from the people in front of me? And my quick answer to that is, I must pull from them their persons. And a person is, in fact, an ethical category. I think my job as a teacher is essentially ethical, whether I like it or not. Though it might be harder to see, I suppose, in the math class, no offense to anyone. And I was totally trained in math before I switched to English, so I know what I'm talking about. There is something about the enterprise of language which is just inextricably bound with the ethical, whether we like it or not. Well, and so now I do have to quote Mitchell because he has said it nicely. He said in an essay called Hunger in America, he said, literacy is not a knack, it is a moral condition. And I believe he's absolutely right. That we are not, I am not teaching somebody merely a skill set that might help them in their jobs, it might even help them in their general critical thinking skills, great. But it's more than that. What he's implying here is that there is an 11th commandment, thou shalt not be illiterate, because it makes you less human. It makes you bad. I buy into this. Students will complain sometimes, what about those poor kids from the inner city who never get a chance? He's not talking about the people who lack the opportunity. He's talking about the people who have it and squander it. Modern literacy, reading and writing are no longer just skill sets, they are conditions of living the ethical life. Critical thinking is a logical pursuit and develops the intellect. Kind of reduced God to a critical thinker, darn it. What happened to the ethical side of him? A developed moral character is indicated not just by the logical use of language, but the ethical use of language, and we don't own language like we own our Chevrolets or even our guns. He has some wiggle room. He was very wishy-washy on this relativism, objectivism thing, and I admire him for that. I thought about it a lot because he brought it up the other day at our preliminary meeting, and I went about it like this. My job is not to draw students solely from darkness of ignorance into the light of knowledge, but actually what I'm supposed to do is to show them how to act like like people with integrity. And what I mean by integrity is the person who wills the good as well as they understand it at the moment. I give him his wiggle room, but I'm objective about the demand that the person who is ethical always wills the good to the best of their ability. I think this is finally my job. it's not that we learn this just through the messages of language, we learn it by the way we use the language. The language today, publicly, is being embarrassingly thrown under the bus. I don't like this. I teach in a field that is inexorably, inextricably bound to ethics because it is bound to language. I actually wrote about this accidentally many years ago, this won't be too long, when I was but a boy. As the university becomes more institutional in character, it alienates its faculty and students from each other. It used to be that administrations administered the wills of the faculties, that the faculties made choices and designed curricula based on interactions with each other and their students. But in the new university, students are not so much learners as they are tuition payers who help to keep the business of schooling alive. A real student is truly difficult to replace, a tuition payer is not, especially, at least not in a democracy perversely committed to letting anything that breathes into school. Because students are more and more functioning as tuition payers, faculties have become the fingers of an administrative hand that must gently massage and please its current and prospective students. To please prospective students is precisely not to educate them. There should be risk in becoming educated. The upshot of all this is that the real students, the risk takers who seek to be educated, to be pulled out of themselves, to become ethical persons, to become ethical users of language, actually become trespassers, in the very places they thought would be home. I skip ahead just a little, you can make the connection. What I'm implying is that we should all be teachers at least some of the time, and we should perceive this not as an endeavor of merely personal satisfaction. We should become deft at bringing others out of themselves, and that any scruple of individual satisfaction must be weighed against the responsibility we have to them, not to ourselves. Biologically, we are genetic individuals. Theologically, we are unique souls. Secular psychology says we are autonomous selves. But culturally, we are persons. This is an ethical category. And I believe that moments of teaching, whether they occur within or without the walls of the academy, are the most important moments for such preciously constituted creatures. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to, I think it'd be great fun to invite everybody to drink and listen to Tim and Bob discuss their version of God. But whether God is integrity or his wisdom.
That's great.
And what the difference is between those would be quite interesting. But let's open it up to our colleagues for questions about any of these topics or anything we didn't discuss.
I was intrigued by your duties that you listed there, and before you even expressed that they were in kind of rank order, I immediately tried to relate them to what I teach our accounting ethics students in terms of their professional ethical priorities, which number one is the public, number two is the profession, number three is your client, number four is your employer, and number five is yourself. So your order is actually fairly much in that order, except public community is number three there, whereas in this traditional thing it'd be number one. But it occurred to me that the order that an educator would give, which I think is basically what you've given here, might well be different than what an educrat would give. Because I think an educrat is going to be number one priority of the community. But in terms of community as taxpayers, the community in terms of received opinions and beliefs and prejudices or whatever, number two would be the students. But again, the tendency, students as being consumers of education, consuming a product. Number three then would be the administration for an educrat, because they see themselves as protectors of the community and of the students. Number four for the educrat might well be the professor, the teacher, the colleagues, because we are seen as a significant part of the process, just like, you have to have salespeople on the floor of JCPenney in order for JCPenney to do what it does. But it occurs to me that from an educrat's perspective, the discipline would be the last. Whereas for you, and arguably for us, it would be the first. And I see that as a fundamental difference between teachers, true teachers, and at least some administrators. And by no means am I saying all. Some administrators, as to how important the discipline is.
Richard Mitchell called them educationists.
Education.
Yeah, for the record.
Might be a kinder term than educrat.
Yeah, you know, it's okay. I think, you know, I wish that we could spend time talking about more, not here, but just in the halls, discussing things such as, well, you know, we need to do this because it's really important for the community, even though I know it hurts the discipline. Or it might help the discipline, but it really hurts the institution. Or this is really, the students have to take it on the chin a little bit here, but it helps our colleagues. Those kind of ethical discussions are interesting, intellectual, and ethical discussions. What drives me crazy is how often the discussions go something like this. I know it's stupid, it doesn't help anybody, but we have to do it. Why? Who says? It's like the emperor has no clothes, and as soon as somebody says, if you know it's stupid and I know it's stupid, why are we doing it? So the arguments usually aren't, well, you might not want to do this, but this is important for the community, so your discipline has to step aside. Or your students have to take a back seat because this is important to the institution. Those kind of discussions would be robust and interesting. I think what's frustrating most of us are that the discussions are usually, no one wants to do this, no one knows why we're doing this, but we just have to do it. And then we all act like, oh, that there's some law that came down that said we have to do it. And the only reason we have to do it is because everybody does it. And nobody says, well, if you don't want me to do it and I don't want to do it, why are we doing it? And I found that when I ask that question, quite usually, guess what? I don't have to do it. And neither do you. So I think as professionals, it's time we push back a little bit. Especially when the people pushing themselves say, this is silly, I don't know why we're doing it. Well, then let's all agree we're not going to do it.
A real brief comment, the community involves politicians with the powers of the purse. And so I think that unfortunately sometimes the goal of our responsibility to the community is not the community, the vital interest of the community, or a community that ought to be interested, and ideally is interested in the students, but it's the politicians. And I would call a good administrator, or an educationist maybe, and a wrong-headed administrator an educrat. But if there's somebody below educrats, it's politicians in terms of this process. Or many politicians, let me put it that way.
Well, let me ask a question of professional philosophers first. What is the distinction between a duty and an obligation? I mean, you use the word duty over and over, Mark, right? Did you mean obligation in some of those situations, or is there really no distinction? It seems to me
Not to adjourn.
there is.
Not to adjourn. I'm not a professional philosopher, so I didn't use it in a philosophical sense, but these guys can answer that. What I meant, my distinction was kind of alluded to by Bob, which was a duty is something you ought to do. An obligation is something you have to do. An obligation is something you do because I need to feed my family and I don't want to get fired. A duty is something I do because I should do it. I ought to do it, and I ought to do it even if it means I get fired. That would be a duty instead of an obligation.
All right. And there are levels of duty, right? So for example, in the Hindu context, there's dharma, or the sacred duty, right? So how do you distinguish as a teacher your relationship to the students as a sacred duty as opposed to just another duty?
How
What
should
makes
one?
a duty sacred?
To the students?
Well, no, to you. I mean, do you have any sacred duty?
Yeah.
All right,
I
how do
think-
you distinguish a sacred duty from a non-sacred one, and how could you relate it to teaching?
Well, I think it's in that very distinction that all of us have to ask that question and decide which duties to them are sacred duties, which hills are they willing to die on, and which ones aren't. How do you decide which battles those are? I don't know.
I think for me, that's a good question, a duty versus a sacred duty. When I organized the Civil War 150th anniversary and the World War 100th anniversary, most of my thinking wasn't how is this fitting into a UEP? My thinking was 620,000 men were killed, that the black men go free and the Union be saved. That's what the outcome was. When I think of Australian soldiers dead in a trench and reserves are called up and they're just walking over their bodies, pounding them into the mud, that's the justification. UEP had nothing to do with it. For me, it was a sacred flame, a duty to remember them and their sacrifices. It was not connected to anything institutional. So I felt a sacred duty to express that meaning to students outside the nomenclatures of institutional categories.
And the examples you gave were both duties to the human as human.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was justification.
Yeah.
If I would challenge any, administrator, anybody else to challenge that.
Excellent point. Remember, Socrates defended himself when on trial by claiming he was not a teacher, because he wasn't paid. Right? All right, so if you are a paid teacher,
Bob, about that.
Right.
I was gonna say, I've got the same thing.
I didn't say paid well. If you are a paid teacher, we not also have some form of obligation, maybe duty, to become savvy within the institution so that we know what we're doing isn't about the, what'd you call it? The
UEP.
The UEP. Right, but we know that there's a game aspect to this, and it's not immoral to learn how to play the game and play it well. Is it, or is it?
I would say no.
I would say it could be.
I would go back to your, just the last point about duties as well. And personally, I would deny that there are sacred duties, which is why I, and kind of what I was saying, try to define the ends. And then we can try to figure out the means to get to those ends. So those ends, at least for me, in relation to our students, I think Aristotle provided us with a great model, based on wisdom, based on happiness, which I tend to agree with him, is that it's an end in itself, right? Nobody tries to gain happiness in order to get a job. We try to get a job in order to perhaps gain happiness or something like that. So I would probably deny that there are any, what we are calling sacred moral duties at all, but I would say that there are good and beneficial ends in which we might have an obligation to promote those ends or something like that. So, what Craig was talking about, I think those are good ends, but I wouldn't say there's a duty there any more than I would say it's a duty to the school or to the student. But provided certain ends, there's better and worse means to get to those ends. Also, I don't know if I would say that Socrates didn't call himself a teacher because he was paid. I think he would say I'm not a sophist because I wasn't paid. But I think you're right, he wouldn't call himself a teacher either.
Well, I think there are obligations or duties, if you will, even, to the administration. I think there are. I think when you sign up to do a job, you agree to certain things. You agree to have certain hours on campus. You agree to teach certain courses. You agree to behave civilly and to do all kinds of duties that you agree to. You have duties to your employer. My position isn't that the only duties we owe are to our students and everyone else be damned. I think we have duties to our employers as well. But that's why I try to do the kind of pragmatic balancing of what is the duty that the employer is asking us. What are they asking of us? How much is that hurting our students, if at all? Maybe it's, hopefully in a perfect world, what they're asking will be benefiting our students. But if we think it's hurting our students, how much, what's it worth, what's the cost-benefit analysis in kind of a utilitarian way? And I think my message is that because it's easy to blame the administration, but I'm not really here to blame Caesar, right? I'm here to blame us. So, because that's what we are. That's what intellectuals ought to do. If we're going to be responsible adults, we should say, what can we do better, not just what does someone else owe us? What are they doing bad? What can we do better? And so my message is, I think if we're to be critiqued at all, it's that we oftentimes don't even fight the slightest fights, the smallest battles that will cost us nothing, and that they're not going to fire us over some small battle that we think we should fight. We should fight those battles. Now, if it's a battle that is a life and death battle, then you have to ask these questions. But so it's a matter of balance. I'm just saying, I think we ought to maybe restore the balance, especially in these recent times, and with recent events that have occurred. we should restore that balance a little bit to the faculty doesn't need to run it high. The faculty can act like faculty again.
Okay, I see that you said here with these differences in governance should come differences in duties and agency. And I wonder to what degree that's actually true, Walmart versus professor. I think all of these on the back also can apply equally to a Walmart employee in that there's some greater, higher duty, I guess you could say, for anyone. And I think that might be some of what you're expressing as well with the dichotomy almost implies that we should act in different ways than a Walmart employee, but I also think in many ways Walmart employees stand up for what they believe in, maybe more than faculty at a college or a university do. And that might be some of the shaming factor of what I'm noticing as well.
Yeah, no, and I think you came in after I had
You had a little.
given my disclaimer that I don't mean to disparage Walmart employees.
No, I don't think you are. I just think that, they do
What I meant by
the
that is
exact
this,
same thing.
is that if we, the less shared governance we have, the less agency we have. For example, just a practical example, if we're in charge of whether a student can drop our class, just a small example, then if a student comes to us and we're in charge of that, we have agency, and we have that governance, and that gives us that power and that agency, then we can say yes, no, we can make that decision immediately, and we can suffer the consequences, and we're responsible for that too. If the student said, if we say, no, you can't drop the class, and this somehow adversely affects that student's life, well, at least, it's our burden to bear. We made the decision, and we suffer the consequences of that decision, like all responsible people do. Or if we say, he says, can you drop the class, and you say yes, and maybe you should have said no. But in other words, we get to make this moral agency. Once you take away that governance, even in a small case like that, so we don't decide just to drop the class, then all of a sudden you've taken away that moral agency. You've taken away, then we end up, when students come to us and they say, I want to drop your class, and let's say that we want them to. But they have to fill out 6 forms, they have to see 2 deans and a co-dean and a tri-dean and 3 chairs and lead before they drop the class. And then they say to us, well, this seems stupid, and we say, yeah, I know, I think it's stupid too, and we shrug our shoulders and say, yeah, that's how it is, I don't like it either, take a number, get in line, fill out a form, it sucks, the whole world sucks, you have no agency, I have no agency. That's the message we send. And it's the message we send because it's the reality. Whereas when we have governance, shared governance and agency, we can tell the student, why should you drop this class? Let's talk about that. I think you can make it. I don't think you should drop it. Let's discuss this. Or, I think you have a good idea. I think you should drop it. But we don't say, oh, well, it's not my job. I can't do anything about it. That's how it is. Get used to it. That's the way America is. No, we just stand in line. It's like the Soviet Union before the fall.
Or convince them to stay because it's better for them to get an F than a W.
Right. Well,
You explain that one.
yeah. Well, then I think you're acting unethically. That's what an example is there. Now you're concerned about your own, retention rate or whatever, than the student's best interest. And that was my point, is that most of these battles that we're fighting aren't life and death battles. If you're worried about your F and your W, which some people are, of course they should put their students' best interest first, even when it actually matters. Most of this stuff that we're worried about getting in trouble for, we won't. It doesn't matter. I've never known anybody here to get fired because they had too many Fs and too many Ws. In the last year, one guy got fired. We know who that was. We know why. It took a lot. I was in those meetings. It took a lot to get fired. You guys can do a lot more than you think you can. Just don't worry about that. These administrators don't want to fire you. One guy got fired, and look what happened. It was not good for them. They don't want to do that again.
Well, let me introduce something very quickly. Go ahead. Did someone else want to?
I just had a quick question.
Go ahead, please.
Does some of this then have to do with modeling behavior as well for students, in that if we are seen as not having agency, we say, I know it sucks, that's my life too, buddy. Is that some of what we should be doing then in terms of, I don't know, to what degree is there a sense of showing our students this is what an institution looks like and this is what it means? Is there some sort of higher to the institution or to higher education or?
I would say yes in regards to modeling, at least from my point of view. Maybe not as far as the question goes, but I would feel very uncomfortable asking my students to do a certain amount of work that I'm not willing to do in return. Which is why, for me, when I give assignments, I work very hard to get those assignments back as quickly as possible. So I think to a certain degree, asking them to do things that we're not doing on any level kind of goes what I would see as kind of a human virtue or a personal virtue that I would want to embrace. So I guess the simple answer to your question, from what I'm saying here, is yes, absolutely. In a very simple way, but yeah.
Well, I may be way off course here, I'm sorry, off base, but I relate to you a lot on this, Tim, and everything you're saying, I'm like, yeah, going right along with you. But it occurred to me that when your students come to my English class after your class, that one of the things that your ethics of teaching, even if you may not consider yourself putting teaching way up there with your ethics, that it's been effective in a way where your students believe what you're saying, they trust you, and then they take what they learn in your class and they apply it in my class. I've watched them apply it in their other classes, I've seen them apply it in their lives, I've seen them apply it in conversation, and I feel like the ethics of teaching, from my point of view, is to model, to show them how the stuff that I'm teaching is meaningful and that they can use it. And that might include having a conversation with their boss at Walmart, right? Because if I teach them effective rhetoric and I show them how to do it ethically, then they're probably gonna win their discussion with their boss at Walmart. And, you know, I don't necessarily understand the priorities, because I don't think I've ever done it. You know, I see where you're going with it, I don't know that I agree, and that's okay. I don't know that I could prioritize my ethics in such a way. It seems so black and white, I'm not sure I'm capable of doing that. I think probably for me, I had the opposite experience as you, in that I knew I wanted to be a teacher. I always knew I wanted to be a teacher, and rhetoric is important. So I decided to teach rhetoric, that way they could use it, right?
Yeah.
So for me, I guess I agree probably most with Bab, in that my discipline allows me to promote ethics.
Well, I think so long as we're talking about modeling, we're talking as much about aesthetics as we are ethics. And I think it could be argued there's no such thing as a conversation between a teacher and a student, or between a Walmart employee and a boss. It must be particularized. Who is it, where is it, when it, there's your rhetoric. And once you do that, you have a particular structure. And once you have that, we're talking about aesthetics as much as we are ethics. And so ultimately where this leads is to the beauty of the relationship as much as the right or wrong of the relationship. So these models that you were proposing earlier, master, apprentice, teacher, student, educator, I guess it would be student, I don't know, learner. These are all aesthetic categories as well as epistemological categories.
But my understanding, the one that did the true and the beautiful were not parallel columns, I don't believe. They were facets of a thing. So we might, for the sake of discussion, separate these things sometimes too much for the ease of clarity. But when you say aesthetic to me and separate it too much from the ethical, I can't.
I was not separating it, I was
Oh, sorry.
moving one into the other.
Well, okay, well then.
That's what I was doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I see, okay. I thought it was
Teaching is an
distinction.
aesthetic act as much as it is.
It's performance.
Any other kind of an act.
Well, I'd just like to offer, bringing that together in my mind is that what we do is a beautiful thing, and we have a certain hidden curriculum in our modeling that, in my mind, when I look around the room in the most beautiful, loving way, we allow students to fly their freak flags. That you're all freaks in your own disciplines and how much you love them, and you're willing to show that and risk yourself daily. And at Walmart, you might give them the tools to do that, but it might give them the freedom to be a free thinker, not just a critical thinker, but a free thinker. And so, Mark, I guess to your point or your drum in creating this conversation is that we need to model that idea that we're allowing them this freedom, this latitude to be themselves and to approach their education in a way that they feel is the best for them, because we're modeling that for ourselves. We have that academic freedom within the classroom to allow Tim to teach the way he teaches, to you teach the way that you teach, not only in our disciplines, but in our own particular styles. I think that's what engages students, at least when I look into our classrooms, when professors are acting as themselves. The students are engaged because they're simply enamored with how much we're enamored with our material. And So, to me, that's the ethic. It's that dance and that relationship. It's the student and the mentor, the teacher and the learner. But it's the dance, and that's the hidden curriculum. You can be you. It's okay to be you. And when you get out of here, you can become more human by understanding these skills and these trades, and you fold that into yourself, and you become the best version of yourself. I guess that would be my ethic, at least, to help the students become the best student they can be, best person.
Likewise, coming back to shared governance and stuff like this, and in a case that I'm aware of, there was a confrontation. The administrator wanted a faculty to change a grade. Now, grades are, it's like there is no shared governance there. That's faculty alone. Nobody tells a faculty member how to grade. And this person was made to feel, well, if you don't change the grade, it was a thing about plagiarism. We're going to fire you. Well, I mean, that's the oldest play in the playbook. I'm going to threaten to fire you. And this faculty member was upset, obviously, and had a conviction. I'm in control of grades. The problem was didn't have the courage of that conviction and did knuckle under and got angry, but anger was not the same as courage. And it seethed and simmered there for a long time. And so it's a good example if we're going to model. I think that the comeback is, and good shared governance is, you can say to any administrator, my commission to teach here is at your disposal, but my syllabus is not, and my grading is not. So you make your decision. That person would have survived the crisis had she stuck to her guns. She would have survived, but she knuckled under and got angry, and it was just a poor example of how we of not modeling our own ethics in this case, and being cowed by a dangerous environment that had developed, and a compromise was made that should never have been
To
made.
paraphrase the great philosopher Rodney King, can't we all just get along? I mean, is it not possible for faculty and administrators to work with it more within the same paradigm so that we don't have such a disconnect with respect to so many things? Or is that just pie in the sky?
I have for
That's a
such a
real
long
question.
time
Because
believed in
our
gold.
priorities are different, that they're going to rank these things, flip them over, so that what is sacred duty to us is disposable to them.
Having been an administrator for 10 years, I would say that we can, but because our side feels that way, the other side gets really defensive, and that's why it hasn't happened yet. Because administrators have the same, they have the same goals. Where this whole I know better and your goals are not right has come along in terms of the fight between faculty and administrators, that I've been wondering ever since I went from one side to the other, and I can see both sides, and I'm like, well, why has this started in the first place? We all have the same overall intentions as to why we get into education. It's egos that get in the way. And so until we solve the ego problem, I think egos are outweighing our ethics. Egos are outweighing our duties and obligations as we see them. And that's where the huge problem and disconnect comes from between the two groups. So yes, you can, but do I see it happening? No. Possibly. Maybe.
Sort of.
Would love for it to happen.
No one has ever really come into my classroom, and been heavy-handed about how I teach. But the thing that concerns me recently is an existential threat of what is going to be allowed to be taught. There's a group out there called Complete College America, and they are a sort of a lawnmower kind of thing, because their goal is to make sure that you complete, which means that anything in the way needs to be eliminated. And part of the big gun, the big cannon, is being pointed at the mathematics department, because it's hard, and not many people complete it. And since it's not being completed, it's gonna, they want to, get rid of it, all right? Or at least narrow it down so much that it's only for this, because they use the subject, which is scaring me also, because disciplines that have to justify their use. Well, you know, you could use going into Walmart because you buy a product, right? But all of us should be very concerned about the use test, because that's the business sort of speak, you know. How are you going to use Plato? How are you going to use reading that poem? How are you going to use the mathematics that you study? How are you going to use making that pot? How are you going to use knowledge of Skinner boxes? I mean, you
Well,
know.
if a book hasn't been checked out of the library in 2 years, shall we just get rid of it? It's not being used. It's taking up space.
Well, my daughter's studying violin. Whether or not she becomes a professional violinist or not remains to be seen. But I'm certainly not going to, at this early stage of the game, rip the violin out of her hands because she'll never use it. That is, who's going to be omniscient enough to decide who's going to use something later in life? Is it going to be the faculty, or is it going to be complete college America who wants to make the decisions?
And we used
So
to tell our
that-
students.
That's something that concerns me, you know. I think that's something that should concern all of us, actually.
Yeah, we used to tell our students when teaching biology curriculum, it's like, you're gonna use 10% of this. You know, so why are we learning all this? It's like, well, because I don't know which 10% you're gonna use. That everybody gets different bits, but you've got a lot of tools.
Yeah, and they say success is when preparation meets the opportunity. Well, I want to try to make the preparation as broad as possible, okay, to hit an unknown moving target, which is the future, right? Complete College America, they seem to have the future set out in this straight line from
With these 42
student goes
credits.
into college, gets the completion, and away they go, you know. Into
It's a
the,
tough thing. Let's give a real world example. I'm a taxpayer, all right? I have a child, old enough to go to college, let's say, or it could be high school, whatever. There's only so much room for certain kinds of materials, a certain amount of materials, right? There's a book on the shelf which is a collection of medieval poetry, all right? There's another, and my child is not studying that. My child is studying something that some other kind of a book might be more useful for what we call success of the child in the institution, right? It's a fair question, I think. What should occupy that space, the medieval poetry or the book on whatever, you know, that the student is studying in class? That's a fair question, and I'm paying for it, right?
And part of the
Yeah.
answer is whether or not you generally see the institution as a training institution or an educational institution in the way that Albert Nock meant it in 1932. Are we set up for the purpose of the development of intellect and moral character, which kind of is how it started, or are we in the business of expertise and skill? That's still a fair question to ask. Now, in his essay, he playfully separates them completely and says, boy, I'd like to build a few, real educational institutions where all we do is work on intellect and moral character. I asked my students the question, what do you think it would be like going to that school? You know what they say? He's going to let us choose our own classes. I go, no. He's going to choose your curriculum from day one. It's just going to be so different from what you're used to because you're going to be reading different things for different reasons. Oh, will I get a job? It's from the disadvantages of being educated. His quick answer is, of course not. But that's not the purpose of education.
I mean, maybe these things are also related to the national economy. I mean, when the economy is good, okay, then there's latitude to explore other things. When the economy is bad, then certain economies must be made, okay? But what's sort of an existential threat for me in math is, the House Bill 5 passed, all right, regarding Algebra 2 in the high schools, okay? And Ron and I were talking about, what is it, English 1302?
Yeah.
It's been demoted.
Mm-hmm.
Right, okay? And
Who needs to
and I'm
read
just wondering,
complex literature?
take that pickaxe and just chop, 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 okay? Are we going to have a diamond after we chop away all that stuff, or are we just gonna have a pile of dirt? I mean, I want a degree to be in something. I'd like to have a degree that, you know, has some substance. I mean, they're, fortunately not all, but there are some colleges and universities that look at what we do as completely unsubstantial. We're 13th grade, you know, we're the catcher's mitt, all right? Right? Instead of the launching pad, we're the catcher's mitt, okay? And it doesn't really matter. And I would like to, you know, not shoot ourselves in the foot and show them that they're right, okay? You know, I like for our requirements to be robust and that you have a well-rounded education.
I think the idea of a well-rounded education is anachronism, and I mean this seriously.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
it could be.
only someone who's never had to struggle will come up with some idea of education which is grounded in the realm of ideas, all right? It's about skill sets. It's about learning what you need to do to survive, get a job. Isn't
But we're
it?
educating
No,
a
that's
different
training
population
school.
now, because when you're looking back at the beginning of education, you're talking about the